Hello everybody, I'm Arjun Hemadi and I'm the author of the novel Captain Khadus. Captain Khadus is set in the year 2025 onwards. It shows a scenario where Indian cricket is in the doldrums and when cricketers are no longer the most popular sportsmen in the country. With badminton, football, wrestling and boxing having taken over as the most popular sports in India. With many foreign tours coming up, the BCCI, the Board of Control for Cricket in India, is looking for a person to take over the captaincy of the Indian cricket team. They turned to Suraj Bhatkar, who has been away from the game for close to 2 years for reasons only he knew of. So will Suraj be able to lead the team to glory, or will the strains of captaincy break him? Captain Khadus is represented by Sohail Mathur of the Book Baker Literary Agency and published by Treeshade Books. It is a must read for all sports, especially cricket fans. I hope you'll enjoy the novel. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to PILF 2021. We're so excited to begin with you all. We have a number of discussions lined up, a wide range of speakers and esteemed guests to make another year yet a lovely one. With no further ado, let's begin. We have with us a wonderful panel of guests for this conversation, reimagining the Maharajahs, princely India and its tales. Our first guest, Manu Pillai. Manu is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, and The Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. Formerly Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, he's also a winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. His essays and writings on history have appeared in the Mint Lounge, the Hindu Open, New Statesman, and other publications. Our next guest for the evening, Dr. Alka Pande. Dr. Alka Pande is an art historian, author, and curator. She has authored numerous books and curated many national and international exhibitions. She is the recipient of the Charles Wallace Award, Knight of the Order of Arts, and letters by French government, L'Oréal Paris Femina Women Award. A prolific writer, Pandey has also authored Body Sutra and Shringara, The Many Faces of Indian Beauty, among her many other works. I request Alka ma'am to take this discussion forward.
Hello.
Hi, Alka.
Hi, Manu. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you again.
Thank you. I want to first begin by thanking Manjari and the Pune International Literary Festival for inviting both Manu and me on this wonderful and thoughtfully conceived session. I know it would have been wonderful if we could have been in person, but in pandemic times, we are also looking at new ways of connecting. And at the moment, there's nothing better than being virtual. So I see Manu looking very relaxed and comfortable in his study, perhaps in Pune or
in Pune, as it happens, yes.
In Pune. And here I am with a mild sun and a windy morning in Delhi. And we are connecting beautifully as if we are in one space. It, of course, is giving me great pleasure to welcome one of my favorite authors. In fact, a person who is, in my opinion, and I can say it, and say it happily, because I'm not sitting face to face with him, because it would seem a bit cheesy, but one of the most brilliant young cultural historians of the country, who is in fact bringing in a new knowledge system in unraveling history. The past actually continues to haunt us, and often the enigma of the past, when we reread and see a retelling by a young voice like Manu, who is very much the present, also helps us in understanding our present better. And this is what I see Manu has been doing with all the books that he has done, the three books that I have read till now. Manu tells history through culture, and this book has virtually got off the press right now. False Allies, India's Maharajahs in the Age of Ravi Varma, published by Juggernaut. And this is his second book, which has been published by Juggernaut. What I really personally enjoy about Manu is his very accessible style of writing, which is, of course, thoroughly researched. It's very, very nuanced. And as you keep reading, you start unpeeling different layers of history. It's like unpeeling an onion. What is really nice, and for me in this book, which was more endearing, was the title of the book, where he says, The Indian Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Varma. As an art historian, Ravi Varma is one of our icons of India's modernity. He is one of the people who brings in technology at a time with his printing press, and also gives the gods a face in the calendar art. What Manu in fact is doing is probably, I can't think immediately or get into his brain, but he's looking at the portraits which Ravi Varma painted, and unraveling them through a visual language, but bringing in his own scholarship and his own understanding of the colonized and the colonial, the power play between the two. And I think as we go along with our session, we will understand. For those of you who have not read the complete book or not read the book, I would definitely advise you to buy a copy of the book. I'm not his agent. I'm just a person who enjoys the way Manu writes. He's extremely articulate, as I had said. And what is really interesting, he's very Indian, because he's very hybrid, he's very, very nuanced, he's complicated, and that's what we are. So now, Manu, I want to just begin. I don't want to hog the whole time talking about you, which I could very happily do. I want to know what led you to writing this particular book. I mean, of course, the title itself is very interesting, False Allies. But what was it? Why did you go on to this book after The Brahmin, the Priest, and blah, blah, blah?
Well, in fact, the idea for this book had been in my head for quite some time, because when I did my first book, The Ivory Throne, it was published in late 2015, and I'd worked 6 years on that book. I realized that, this whole caricature we have about the princely states, that it was somehow this highly feudal setting. There was an oppressive Raja sitting in a palace, and everybody else was just suffering under this feudal rule. That really didn't stand up to scrutiny. In that one study of the princely state of Travancore, I discovered that there was caste politics, there was communal politics, there was, of course, ways by which imperialism was resisted, there was politics in the palace. It was actually as complicated a game as politics is today. Just because these people were Rajas does not change the fact that they were politicians as well. They were people in the business of wielding power, sustaining power, and holding on to it no matter what. And of course the strategies were different. Genealogy mattered, religion mattered. And I realized that a single princely state gave me so much to think about. About gender, about caste, about state formation, all kinds of historical subjects. And that it even helped understand contemporary politics better. Because in Travancore, for example, politics for a long time rotated and revolved around, the caste parties, the Nair, the Irava, then the Syrian Christians. And to this day, you will find that a lot of Congress factions in Kerala are still built around these communal identities. So to understand today's Congress in Kerala, you need to sort of be able to understand where it comes from, and that takes you to princely politics. So at that time, I realized that obviously there was more to the princely states than we generally think of. And the more I read, the more keen I became to do a book on the princely states. It was just a question of what kind of book. I didn't want to do a general book. I didn't want to do an introductory kind of book, because there is one, for example, Barbara Ramusak published one in 2004, which is an introduction to the princely states. I wanted to get in some depth into several states and see what it can tell us about India itself. Because ultimately, the princely states covered 40% of the Indian subcontinent's landmass. Why is it that when we discuss modern Indian history, we seem to speak largely about British India, which the British directly governed 60% of the country, but not the 40%? The 40% also matters. In fact, even to understand colonialism, the 40% is important, because although the British said the princes were under indirect rule, which is to say the British were the suzerains and the princes were their vassals, in reality, within the states, it was an Indian ruler with Indian ministers, with Indian bureaucrats ruling over Indians under colonial conditions. So the experience of colonialism in princely states is very different from the experience of colonialism in British India. There were overlaps between the two, there were contacts between the two. Often, princely politics would aggravate nationalists in British India. Often, events in British India would have an impact on princely India. And for some reason, we hadn't given the princely states their due. And I thought, I would try and get into the subject. As I said, I wasn't sure how and in what format, because I didn't want to do a general textbook. So then that's where Ravi Varma came into the picture, because he was the society painter. He was the man who was born in a princely state. He went about painting Rajas of assorted princely states. And I thought, if I just follow him, if I just go after his career track, what I find is an eclectic collection of states. You have Travancore, which began to be bureaucratized in the 18th century. Then he goes off to Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu, another side of the country, where it's a very different system, where the royal family itself comes from what the British called a criminal tribe. Again, a very different history. Then he goes off to Baroda, which is a Maratha ruled kingdom, but the subjects are Gujaratis. Then he comes to Mysore, which has its own internal dynamics and history going back to the Tipu Sultan period. And finally, he ends up in Rajputana shortly before his death, and that's a completely different system from anything he's seen in southern India. So instead of me picking and choosing states, instead of me trying to, in some ways, even subconsciously having an argument and then picking states to fit the argument, if I just followed him, the argument would sort of take shape based on what I was finding. I would be led by the evidence rather than arranging the evidence in a way that suited me. And that's why I chose him, and that's why I've chosen these five princely states. The book covers five states, their internal histories, their politics, the role women played in some of these states. Ravi Varma was again useful here because his own family members were royalty. His sisters-in-law were Maharanis, his granddaughters were Maharanis. So I could look at gender just by looking at the dynamics of his own family members. And overall, that helped put together the book. The only thing I left out was the princely state of Hyderabad, where Ravi Varma did not get a royal commission, much as even though he tried. And therefore, I didn't include it in the book. But the other reason was also that the book would have become very long. It's already 550 pages, and I'd vowed after the Ivory Throne that I would never write a 700-page book. So I cut Hyderabad out and made do with the remaining five states.
So, with this really interesting response to my very simple question, I find there are certain points I want to take off from here before I ask you my next codified question. You use the word business of power. You use the fact that
It's 1 o'clock.
You talked about the fact that there was a power which was ruling another power. So there is like almost like a bipolarity of power in India. And then you are, of course, talking of the politics of politics, the politics of gender, identity, caste, class. But can I say you're being a little clever by hiding behind the society painter of the portraits of the society painter? You are in some ways kind of placing, if there was any blame, on Ravi Varma himself. Is that not being a little bureaucratic yourself?
No, I don't think I'm placing any blame on him. I'm just
Mm.
using him to
In case
shortlist
there is.
the states that I'm studying, because I didn't. The issue with choosing the states yourself is that, how do you choose? Each of these states
Mm.
is very diverse. So in the end,
Mhm.
there'd be some kind of a selection bias. I would end up picking states that would appeal to me, which meant that the final study would be a bit skewed. Whereas by
Okay.
simply following him, what happens is that he chooses the states for me. So I can go in without a preconceived notion of what I'm going to find. That's why these states are so diverse. Each state is distinct from the other. There are common elements, but there are huge variations as well. And I could only do that because I use Ravi Varma as my as the person who's guiding me into these states. Otherwise, I would have, given that I'd studied Travancore, I would have perhaps chosen a Mysore and a Baroda because they were equally advanced states, and confined my study just to these so-called model states or the good states, and not looked at, say, a Rajput state where the administrative systems were weak, where the rulers were feudal. I may not even have ended up there. I may have ended up looking at the good states and making some very over-the-top claims about princely India. I think Ravi Verma
Mhm.
allowed for a balance to be brought into the narrative. He allowed me to look at states of a whole sort of variety, so that I would not end up bringing my biases into the argument, and that the each state would help me frame the argument. I would not be imposing an argument on the states and reading it in the way I wanted. What I discovered in each state would end up making my argument for me.
Mhm. So, which takes me to my other question, which I've always wanted to ask you. Why is it that you are concentrating on, looking at a historical narrative below the Narmada in the south of India? Is it because you yourself feel more at home since you belong to the place, in the sense your origins are from there? The fact that you probably know Malayalam well, the fact that you can negotiate those languages, and if you go above the Narmada, then it becomes more of a Persian, Urdu speaking, Devanagari belt. Is that one of the reasons? Is that what, because you look into a lot of primary research, as I see. So, is that one of the reasons why you till now stuck to?
Well, the advantage is that I can actually read Devanagari. I can read Hindi as well as Marathi. So for this
Mm.
book, I did use some Marathi material. I'm from
Mm.
another project I've got going on. I remember a few months ago, I read a Hindi book from 1915. It's a short 100-page book. It took me a couple of hours to really, get a hang of it and then reread it constantly so that I wasn't making any mistakes. But I can manage Hindi as well. But you're right, I can't do Persian, Urdu, and so on. But the larger attraction to the south is not because of that. It's simply because we tend to neglect the south a little bit, in the sense that often the center is the north and the south is more or less something that revolves around the center. Whereas in my view, I think we can't have any one fixed center that way. We should be able to look at Indian history as a whole. Each of these regions together constitute what we now call Indian history. It's not as though there was Delhi and the rest. It really is the case that there was Delhi, but there was also other elements, other areas, and there were interesting things happening in all of these areas. Even some small things like the fixation with the Taj Mahal, and I keep wondering, why aren't we fixated with the great temple that Rajaraja Chola built? Because
Mm.
it's 1,000-year-old
Definitely.
temple. It's an amazing structure. It should really
Mm.
generate that kind of interest and that kind of attraction among the minds of all Indians really. I mean, there are some issues like that, but in general, the larger point is that because South India seems to get the short end of the stick, I was a bit keen that I wanted to do something that would sort of try and rebalance things somewhat. Even now, there's no dearth of studies on the Mughals, for example. One of the
Mm.
reasons I did the Deccan Sultans, Rebel Sultans, my second book, is because we weren't talking enough about the Deccan Sultanates. If we did speak of the Deccan, it was about the Marathas or the Mughal invasion. But what about a 5-century period where you did have Islamic sultanates in the Deccan that were not Mughals, that were not anybody else. They were their own people, they were their own political entities, and they deserved some kind of study. And in general, this is something that comes up in all my work. I tend to pick up subjects that have in some ways or the other been neglected. So the first book, it was a female ruler of Travancore who had been marginalized on the basis of gender, and I wanted to bring her back into the conversation, into the limelight. With the second one on the Deccan Sultan, same reason. Why aren't we talking about the Deccan Sultanates? I grew up in Maharashtra, and we had these small cameo appearances of these sultans here and there in a larger narrative about Shivaji. And I kept thinking, but why? They created the foundations on which the Maratha state later emerged, which means that we must be able to go back and study them as well. And even with this book, again, the point is that 40% of Indian history or modern Indian history is marginalized under various stereotypes and cliches. And I wanted to try and dig a bit deeper and study these princely states to see that, were they actually more interesting than they look? Was there more serious business taking place in the princely states? And I'm glad to say that the answer has been yes. But yeah, in general, it's just an attraction towards subjects that haven't in some ways got their due attention.
So you're going really to Spivak when she says, "Do the subaltern have a voice?" In some ways, you are giving the subaltern a distinct voice and bringing the margins into the center. Since we do, most of us, whether we are insiders or outsiders looking into India, Delhi does become a center because
Yeah.
it is the politics and seat of power. And in some ways, it has always been a marker of power for India, which in many ways is really the no, there is in some ways, not just because of language, but also the distance
Mm.
between the north and the south. And often I feel that India is not just a country, it's a continent.
Yeah.
It's like Europe with 29 states and union territories. Having said that, since you are familiar with a lot of Indian mainstream languages, what are the sources and how do you look into unraveling these sources? Because you're looking at obviously new data, new ways of historical referencing. It's not the encyclopedic colonial way. So could you just also shed some light to all of us on
So
how do you
in a book like False Allies, the sources were, as usual, diverse. There was a whole amount of oral history. For example, on Ravi Varma's birth, there are all kinds of narratives just about his birth. The one story goes that his mother was possessed when she was pregnant by a yakshi, and the yakshi had to be exorcised and removed and installed in a shrine. Now that shrine still exists in Ravi Varma's ancestral home. Another oral version of the same story has it that the yakshi possessed the mother but discovered the mother was carrying this wonderfully gifted, predestined for greatness kind of kid, and decided to withdraw herself. And a third story has it that the Yakshi presented the mother two options: you'll either have a son with great talent or a son who live long or something like that. And the mother chose great talent, or was it talent and wealth, something like that. She gives two options. So I think each of these oral stories is telling us something. They're all about this cult that was built around Ravi Varma in Kerala, which took the historical man and deified him. So oral history gives you perspectives of that kind, and you get that even with some of the other material, with some of the other rajas, etc., who've been covered in the book. Then there's archival material, sources from the National Archives, which is the correspondence with the British, for example, private papers of Lord Curzon, of Lord Minto from the early 19th century, late 19th century, material like that. Parliamentary reports, because often a princely state like Mysore, which was under British rule for 50 years, it was a huge debate as to whether it should even be returned to the Mysore royal family. And a lot of this was actually discussed in the British Parliament. It was ultimately in London that the decision was taken, overturning a decision that was taken in India by the Viceroy's office. And I think that parliamentary correspondence, all the papers and all the discussions and even the debates in Parliament, that is an interesting source. Then there's a lot of interesting material from newspaper sources, because newspapers carried the live debates at the time that as they were unfolding. I did not use papers such as Kesari, for example, which is Marathi. This book primarily is built on English material. Occasionally, there's a bit of Hindi, Marathi, Malayalam here and there, but it's mainly modern period. I found that a lot of the material is in English, and in the kind of argument I was making, that was the primary source I tapped. Even the English papers, however, going back to the 1850s, there are debates happening on whether British rule is good for India or not, whether the princes are treated well by the British or not, whether the Indians should stand with the princes or stand with the British or not. So these newspaper debates are increasingly interesting to read, because they don't really make a distinction between how the British are behaving in British India and how they're behaving in princely India. To the nationalists, princely India mattered as well, and their autonomy mattered as well. Then, of course, biographies, because a lot of the rajas and their ministers were very well read people, especially by the late 19th century. They were very proficient in English. They used political vocabularies from the West to articulate their own political resistance, which is an interesting process in their own right. And that comes across in their collected writings, their letters, and their published works that we need to follow up, and of course older biographies that exist of these figures. So it's by combining these sources that you're able to construct an argument and get a fuller picture of what was happening at that time. And it really is all kinds of things. There's this bit where it's MG Ranade's collected writings, and you discover that he envisioned a post-colonial India as having a House of Commons, which would be elected by people in British India, but a House of Lords where the Rajas would sit, because to him, the Rajas were a legitimate part of India's political landscape and could not be excluded from India's political future. You read a biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, sitting here behind me, by Dinyar Patel, and that covers the less known aspects of Dadabhai Naoroji's career, which is that before he became famous for winning an election to the House of Commons in London, he was actually a princely minister in the state of Baroda. He actually served as a diwan in a princely state, which most people discussing Dadabhai Naoroji don't talk about. And Dinyar Patel's research unearthing that phase in Dadabhai Naoroji's life was critical to my further sort of argument about Baroda state and how it dealt with the British. Even sometimes another sources, even private letters, even private writings that were not meant for public consumption. There was a diary of a British tutor of the last Maharaja of Travancore, and it's wonderful because it's not meant really, it's his personal diary. He's writing largely for himself, and he's talking about things that you don't necessarily find in the official records. A very sort of ringside view of what's happening, little funny things that have happened in the palace, comical things, little tussles for power that don't necessarily make it into the archives. That kind of material comes out of that personal diary. So combining these sources, you're able to construct something of a rich, layered, complicated picture. And of course, you have to analyze it critically yourself. You can't take any of it at face value. So when I read in a record that says that the Maharaja of Mysore, in the very first year that he came to power, he handled 900 files. It's not about the files. It's about, why is that statement even there? Because they're trying to communicate that the Maharaja doesn't just look pretty and sit on a throne. He actually has a job, which includes reading files, 900 files in his very first year. He's a working, active Maharaja. Even the artwork, you look at the paintings Ravi Varma did of these rulers, and you start reading those paintings a certain way, and you realize that every object in the background, every element around the ruler, even the ruler's stance and pose, all of this has political meaning. All of this is meant to signify something. And the example I typically give is a portrait of the Pudukkottai Raja, because he's actually a weak ruler, but Ravi Varma gives him this rather strong, in control kind of posture.
Would you
He's
like to show
wearing,
that image,
I
Manu?
don't
You
think
have a
we can
book?
share it on this,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Okay.
But if you Google it, you'll see it. Ramachandra Tondaiman was the name of the ruler. Weak ruler, but made to look like he's very much in control, wearing like a sherwani, a richly embroidered one. On the face of it, a typical Maharaja. But then you look around him. Behind him is this temple Gopuram to his family god and goddess, and that's supposed to signify continuity. It's supposed to signify tradition, heritage, and how his kingship goes back into time. The sort of Hindu credentials of the royal family. But equally, the same Raja's hand rests on a copy of the Iliad, because he's trying to also communicate that he reads books in the English language and he values the same classics that Westerners value. And there's all kinds of little elements like this. The books that Ravi Varma keeps in the background of his royal portraits. The only exception I can think of is the Rajput portraits, because when he paints the Maharana of Udaipur, that's the one ruler who does not wear his English medals, who does not wear his English decorations. He in fact wears the old Mughal style angrakha, and he has a shield and a sword. Essentially, Ravi Varma is painting him in a new style, which is oil painting, but the man himself prefers still to be depicted in the same way his ancestors were long before, which is with their weapons and with their traditional clothes, nothing to do with the British. So even he's making a political statement, that particular Raja, by getting Ravi Varma to paint him like this, as opposed to with his British decorations and his British honors. He's also making a statement that actually I don't value it. What I value is my Rajput credentials, and that leads you to the question of what were these Rajput credentials. So even the paintings are an important source in understanding princely India, because then as today, portraiture is not just about capturing likenesses. It's about the self image of the sitter, but sometimes also about what the painter wants to communicate. So these multiple, very many sources are what allow you to sort of bring back the story and tell it in a way that is interesting, rich, complicated, not simplistic, not easy to sort of deal with, because it is in black and white. It really is about all these things happening simultaneously, and we have to be able to look at the complexity as complexity and understand it.
So, what I see in your research, particularly with this book, is that you've also got an added element, not just of archival material, but also of the visual. So, that of course, that's what makes the book even more interesting. Having said that, do you make a lot of notes and then do you make a lot of drafts? Because nowadays research is, a lot with the internet and the computer helps us a lot. Do you make, because the kind of work that you're doing, do you make long handwritten notes and then you make many drafts? What is it you do?
I do work with a lot of drafts because that's usually how it works better for me, which is that there's always one sitting of writing where you end up sitting for a long stretch, weeks and weeks and weeks, and you hammer out a kind of skeletal draft, which could be for each chapter and then for the entire book, chapter by chapter. Sometimes, of course, the chapters may get rearranged, but that skeletal draft is critical for me just to get the basic thing done. Then the next draft is about building the argument, making sure you've got all the material, making sure the citations are in place, all your diverse sources are in place. And then finally, I go to the third draft or the third stage of the writing process, which is when you focus on the language and you start looking at the sentences. You start making sure that each paragraph is readable, each page is readable, that things aren't being repeated, that every chapter is making an independent argument, but something that can be woven into the larger argument, but each chapter also has a standalone point to make. Those things happen at that level. So yeah, I do work with multiple drafts. um Notes, yes. I mean, I don't use handwritten notes. I have Word documents, which I've learned is very old fashioned for millennials, in that many people now have all these new softwares that they use. I still have Microsoft Word, and I have each document marked and named a certain way that I can understand. Perhaps a third person won't be able to understand it, and I put my notes into these Word documents, and that's how I sort of collect all the material and use it. But notes are important for me, although in the final published version of book, inevitably there's a lot that you end up having to discard, because you can't stuff a book with everything you want to say simply because you want to say it. Ultimately, it also has to sit well, it also has to read well. So my technique to sort of bypass that is to throw everything else into the notes. So if somebody wants, if I can't include something at length in the main narrative because it will become too much of a digression, I make sure that there are the notes, and the notes can guide an interested reader into those digressions, into those interesting areas, if they should want to do that. So even with this book, of the 550 pages, I think 150 pages are notes, because for me, notes are a big thing, and some of them are almost a page long, because it matters. I think when you make any kind of larger argument of this nature, and this is a kind of revisionist argument, it's important to have supporting material, and to make that supporting material very clear for anybody who may want to explore further facets of it, or even in some ways to sort of check up whether you've done your research properly and whether it stands up to scrutiny.
So now I want to get very specifically into your book, Manu. I want to read the opening quote which you've got here of Indira Gandhi, 1967, where you quote her saying, "Go ask the Maharajahs how many wells they dug for the people of their states when they ruled them, how many roads they constructed, what they did to fight the slavery of the British. If you look at the account of their achievements before independence, it's a big zero." Now, this in some ways is interesting because you are looking at two politics, the ruler and the ruled. Um, Before I ask you my final question on the politics of the ruler and the ruled, I'm very keen to know which is one of your favorite uh, portions of the book, and I would really like you to read from there because it would give the audience also not just the sound of the book, but you and the sound of the book.
This the Indira Gandhi quote I used essentially because, in some ways, it encapsulates precisely what most people think about the Rajas, that they were just these useless people, relics from the past that somehow continued into the mid 20th century, and that they had to be removed almost by force, because if they hadn't, then somehow India, they would have held India back in some ways. And I use it right at the start of the book because the rest of the book in some ways challenges that view. It tries to argue that that's too simplistic an argument, that there's a lot more that's taking place with the princely states. And since you mentioned reading, I'll read a chunk from the Baroda chapter, because what's important here is that even what Indira Gandhi is also essentially suggesting is that they misgoverned. The Rajas were not good at governance and administration. But one thing I discovered is that in the colonial period, the term misgovernment was a very politically loaded word, which is that the British often used the term misgovernment to get rid of princes who were anti British, who stood up to them. And sometimes there were other Indian factions that manipulated the British in order to get some of these Rajas toppled. In Baroda, it was a Rani. There was a queen, and she didn't like her brother-in-law, who was the Raja. And she not only played the British, she also got people to complain against him. Created, I mean, he was not a great ruler. He had his flaws. He was a rather flawed man. But even so, it was other people. It was the sister-in-law. It was the woman in the palace, in the royal family, who was able to give this impression that Baroda was somehow being hugely misgoverned, so as to topple the man, so that she could come back and then determine the future destinies of the state. So even terms like misgovernment, etc., have an interesting way of looking at them when you look at the princely states and how the British dealt with it. And I just read the opening section of the Baroda chapter. The chapter is called "A Patron of Sedition." It's on page 139, and here we go. On the morning of 9th November 1874, an Englishman called Robert Fair suddenly felt an attack of nausea in princely Baroda. The middle-aged Colonel Fair was British resident at the Maratha court here and had been somewhat under the weather for several days prior. That morning, though, was different. He had, as usual, returned from his walk and taken a few sips of the Pomelo Sharbat his servants always kept ready. Sitting down to write a letter, however, a sudden squeamishness, in quotes, possessed him. Deciding it was the juice, he threw out the rest, only to notice something odd. As I was replacing the tumbler on the wash hand stand, Fair recalled, I saw a dark sediment collected at the bottom. Holding it closer to the eye, the thought occurred at once to my mind that it was poison. He sent off the substance for analysis and telegrammed his superiors. Bold attempt to poison me this day has been providentially frustrated. Interestingly, despite the gravity of the claim, when the local Maharaja came to see him hours later, the resident kept mum. It was days before the incident was broached, news having reached the palace through other channels. In his official commiseration, the ruler expressed horror at this plot by some bad man to liquidate the resident. If it becomes necessary for you to obtain my assistance in proving the criminal's guilt, the Maharaja offered, the same will be given. Unfortunately for Malhar Rao Gaikwad of Baroda, in Fair's mind, the criminal was none other than the Maharaja himself. Ever since his arrival in the principality, the colonel had found himself unable to get along with the ruler. Neither was, to be fair, a particularly likable type. Described as an overbearing, irascible British official, dreaded and detested by all Indians, Fair had left his last posting in a muddle. The Maharaja, meanwhile, was textbook dubious. A little over a decade ago, when his brother sat on the throne, he was locked up for conspiring to murder him. His sibling's death, however, restored Malhar Rao to liberty, and succeeding to power, he showed, in quotes, a most sweeping and vindictive character. The minister who had investigated the murder conspiracy, for example, was left to rot in prison where he died mysteriously. So too Malhar Rao had developed a habit of seizing women he liked and forcing them into palace service. As the Hitechu reported, which is a newspaper, girls were taken like pigeons and subjected to filthy violations. Then there was the matter of his newest wife, Lakshmi Bai, who was the ruler's mistress, marrying him while already pregnant. When the Maharaja expressed a desire to proclaim his son by her as heir, Fair demurred. Furious, Malhar Rao apparently issued orders that anybody who did not refer to his wife as a Choti Rani or junior queen was liable for a fine of 15 rupees. Baroda was a case study in what the British deemed misgovernment. Its Maratha rulers were originally conquerors in Mughal Gujarat, subject to the Peshwas of Pune. By the 19th century, however, they obtained independence from the Peshwas with aid from the East India Company. Territories were carved up between the British and the Gaikwads in a way that the kingdom came to comprise several disconnected tracts. Then in 1857, during the Great Rebellion, Khande Rao, who was Malhar Rao's elder brother, stayed loyal to the company, for which the dynasty was granted second highest rank among India's princes. This was why, despite a deepening crisis, colonial authorities did not intervene excessively in the state's affairs. In Khande Rao's time, for example, new cesses and levies were recklessly imposed to pay for the court's extravagancies and collected by the harshest measures, we read. No complaints were listened to till discontent became general among all classes. The Maratha elite were disconnected from their Gujarati subjects, and Malhar Rao did little to improve things when he succeeded his brother. On the contrary, he seemed capable of surpassing him in immoderation. Where the old Maharaja commissioned a carpet of gems and pearls, his heir cast cannons of gold to fan his competitive vanity. Residents ventured the occasional menacing advice, but wrote much of this off as typical Oriental conduct. That is, till Fair decided to tutor Malhar Rao in good governance as well as princely morality. I think I'll end the reading there, but essentially, it's a preamble that goes on to talk about a legal case where Fair claims that the Maharaja tried to assassinate him or murder him through poison. And the Maharaja, who was a man with many, many, many flaws, kidnapping women, all of that, in the actual inquiry that followed, they could not convincingly pin him down. They could not convincingly show that he had actually plotted. But because, as I mentioned earlier, the Maharani sitting elsewhere, she didn't like the Maharaja either. She had been fueling up complaints against him, creating this image that he was a complete disaster. The British decided to topple him as well as his son and install Sayajirao Gaikwad III, who then became a very famous ruler, but who was originally at that time a 12-year-old boy working on a farm and illiterate. So you essentially have the Maharaja who's toppled not because they were able to prove that he actually tried to kill anybody, but simply because of this misgovernment claim. Even his son, whom he had recognized and said, this is my son and therefore should be heir, that boy was also excluded from succession. Eventually, a third candidate was also excluded from succession. And a little boy was chosen from far away, a very distant branch of the family, chiefly because the British wanted to manipulate him, and even the Dowager Maharani wanted to manipulate him and shape him into a kind of loyal kid. It's a much more complex story, and there's a lot happening here that tells you about colonial sort of pressures on the Rajas, the role these royal women played, the duplicity that existed in some of these legal trials of Maharajas that the British conducted. And the chapter then goes on. It's my favorite chapter in the book. It's also the longest chapter in the book.
So I think we're also, I want to leave time for people to ask their questions, but I cannot let you go without asking this particular question. In your opinion now, Manu, after having read so many of your the varied sources and including the visual material, do you have a definite view? Who do you hold responsible for the politics of the nation, the British or the Indian Maharajas, for misgovernance, for the politics of power, for the falsity in alignment? Uh, do you
I think
have any?
these narratives we often shape retrospectively. We think that it can somehow be pinned down on any one group, but in reality, one of the things I studied is that it was far more complex. There were times when the British, when the Rajas needed the British. I can give you two examples where you would think that by today's standards, this is like siding with the invader. One is Maharaja of Patiala. Who was the first recognized Maharaja of Patiala in the late 18th century? It was a man who came from fairly humble backgrounds, a local chieftain of sorts. He gets his official recognition as a Raja from Ahmad Shah Abdali, the Afghan, who's actually just invaded, defeated the Mughals, sacked Delhi, and this gentleman goes and diplomatically parleys with him, and in return gets a khilat or a robe of honor and the title of Raja, which a few years later his son gets confirmed again by the Afghans. On the face of it, oh, look, an Indian Raja siding with the enemy. But in reality, it's much more complicated. These borders did not exist at that time. Invasions were not all that new. The chessboard, the pieces on the chessboard were all moving. The Mughal state was in a free fall. So in general, of course, people were jostling for power and they needed legitimacy. And legitimacy given by a superior power, whether it was Ahmad Shah Abdali or anybody else, it mattered. That's why Patiala took it. In the south, it was Pudukkottai. Pudukkottai were, as I said, members of a criminal tribe in quotes, which did not actually have royal power. At one point, they become warlords. They get married into an important royal family. From there, they manage to get a small fiefdom. The fiefdom becomes the nucleus of a bigger state. But how do you graduate to full Raja status? In their case, they made use of the East India Company. By siding with the East India Company and his ally and their ally, the Nawab of Arcot, the Pudukkottai chieftains became Rajas and then graduated into political power. So on the one hand, you have Rajas having such dealings with the British and with foreigners, as it were. Then there is also other aspects to it. Once the British were entrenched in India, once they became this extremely powerful colonial dominant force, it was the people, the Rajas no longer had any interest in supporting the British. The British had become too big and they now needed to be kept in check because they would swallow up the Rajas whole. So now the Rajas started siding with the Congress party. When the Congress was founded, it was the Rajas who started giving it large donations, large amounts of money in grants. Congressmen were hired as statesmen, as divans and ministers in princely states. Even a lot of regional nationalist clubs like the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, or even abroad, Nada by Nauroji's East Indian Association in London, it was funded by Maharajas because they needed these organizations to put pressure on the British externally. So, on the face of it, the Rajas are allies of the British, but in reality, now they're trying to subvert the empire from within. But again, ultimately, as all people in power behave, whether it's the British, whether it's post colonial India and the politicians we've been dealing with ever since, everybody's interested in clinging on to their power. So when the Rajas by the 1930s see that Congress and mass agitation can also topple them, they transfer their allegiance from the Congress to organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha. So they're essentially interested in survival. They're essentially interested in keeping their power, and with good reason, I suppose, because they didn't see themselves as illegitimate. They saw themselves as people descended from old royal families, as people who had actively and legitimately claimed that political space as theirs. Why should we give it up? Simply because the Congress thinks we should give it up. So then they transferred their allegiance elsewhere, which is also why the book is called False Allies, because in one reading they were allies of the British, but then they also tried to subvert the British. In another reading, in the early phase of the freedom struggle, they were allies of the nationalists, but ultimately they proved false allies even to the nationalists. In the end, like all people in power, the Rajas were self interested in preserving their own power. And the book does not glorify them, it just says that the princely states and the Rajas were not idiots. They were interesting political figures, and therefore we should study them. It's not about good or bad. Is it were they interesting from a historical and political perspective? And my argument in the book is they were.
So they're all basically very interesting case studies from which
Yes.
we can draw our own conclusions. Thank you so much, Manu. And now I'm waiting to get questions from our audience, and we can,
I
deal
think
with
we
that.
don't have one. I see it in the chat box that it says there are no questions. So
Oh,
we can,
oh my
yeah.
God! Then we can continue. So tell me, who is the person who has fascinated you most, Manu, amongst the Maharajas of these 5 states that you've looked at, and
It,
why?
as it happens, it's not a Maharaja, it's a Maharani. Because
Ah,
when I was discussing Baroda, I told you about the Maharani who
yes.
wanted to topple her
Mm,
brother-in-law. And
mm,
this is the other thing: we assume in princely states there was no. I mean, these people came from these old families, and there's some kind of unbroken line of descent, which is not true. Often the princely lines did run out of heirs. They would adopt people from obscure families, vaguely distantly related to them, but often coming from perhaps very middle class backgrounds. In this Maharani's case, she was born in a village called Rahimatpur near Satara in Maharashtra, the daughter
mm,
of a village headman. Nothing more glamorous than that. Her father was a village headman. It was an agrarian economy. There was nothing rich. She even had to help her mother in the kitchen. That was the kind of life she led. At the age of 13, however, she becomes wife to the Maharaja of Baroda. And here's the interesting thing: Maharaja of Baroda is extremely wealthy. But Baroda as a royal family, their pedigree only goes back to the 18th century. They come from much more humble origins. Whereas this girl who's helping her mother in the kitchen, her family have been part of the aristocracy back from the days of the Deccan Sultans, going back very many centuries. So even though her family is now in let's say modest circumstances financially, their bloodline is important. Here, the Maharaja has the money, but not the blood. So, by marrying this 13-year-old, the Maharaja is able to combine both. Of course, his other main purpose is that he's got two wives before, but no sons, as a result of which he
mm.
needs another wife so he can have children. And so he marries this 13-year-old girl, even though he's approaching 40. And, she sort of owns that position. 4 years later, he passes away. She's only 17 years old. And she does not retreat into the Zanana as a nobody and quiet to sort of quietly spend the rest of her days. Instead, she decides, let me see if I can wield some political power. She declares herself pregnant and basically says, till my child is born, you can't give power to the Maharaja's brother because I may produce a male heir, and that male heir will then succeed. Of course, the Maharaja's brother hems and haws, but finally they have to wait a few months. She gives birth to a girl. Having given birth to a girl, she realizes, okay, now I can't help it. My brother-in-law is going to come to power. Again, she refuses to retreat into the Zenana. Instead, she leaves Baroda, comes to Pune. Pune is that time in British India. It's where all the big journalists are, Tilak, Gokhale, the big Maratha press, the big Maratha intellectuals are all in Pune. Here, this lady starts, she's only 18 years old. She starts selling her jewelry. She starts selling her personal effects for cash and uses this cash not only to bribe people in Baroda to complain against the Maharaja, but also to bribe servants of the British resident or the British agent to fan his own animosity against the Maharaja. As I said earlier, she was playing both of them. Ultimately, she wins this game. The Maharaja is toppled, and she is invited to come back to Baroda and become the person who determines who will now succeed to power and take a role in politics. And she brings in this, she gets rid of a 30-year-old claimant and exiles him to Banaras with the help of the British, and brings in this 12-year-old boy because she thinks she can control him, because she sees herself as a political actor as well, not just as a woman whose role is domestic. And this is true of many of these royal women. I think they are in many ways equally fascinating as the royal men, because they were not people who thought they occupied domestic spaces. They thought of themselves as political figures in political spaces. And Jamna Bai of Baroda is an excellent example. I hope one day someone does a full-length biography of Jamna Bai of Baroda.
Mm. Would you not be interested in doing that, Manu?
No, I think I've brought her, into the limelight, and to a certain extent with this book. Now I think someone else needs to pick up from there and do that, if someone ever does.
So, a person like you, you finished one massive tome. Are you working on something next at the moment, or are you taking a little break so that you can? It's like leaving the land fallow so that you can
No, I'll
rejuvenate.
call it a working break, in the sense
Okay.
that I'm not doing a book at the moment, but I am
Mhm.
trying to finish my PhD thesis. I've got to
Ah,
turn it in
mhm.
September, which means there isn't
Okay.
actually that much time now, and I really need to sit down and get my act together and finish my thesis. So fingers
Mm.
crossed, and hopefully by September I'll be able to turn my thesis in. That's the focus for now. I think this
And
book
what
is
is
done.
your thesis on, Manu? For
It's again history. It's again, and
okay,
I've gone back to Kerala for it, because I've worked
okay,
on Travancore, for example, for 6 years in the past. So I
yes,
thought, since I've already built up that much information and knowledge and familiarity with the material, it makes sense to go back to that for my thesis. But yeah, I won't reveal more till the thesis is done. I'm
sure.
superstitious about about talking
No,
about
no.
things that are not yet done.
Mm. No, no, one understands that perfectly. Do we see any more questions or shall we continue? I
No, I
can't
think
make
we're
out.
done. I think we're done, because it says we're running out of time now.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. So it's
we've
been a
got, I think,
pleasure.
2 minutes only, so I think we can
It's
we
been
can
a
close.
pleasure, as always, speaking with you, Manu. I particularly, I'm three-fourths through the book, and I've really enjoyed the way it's enthralling. It's enthralling, and it's not really a textbook of history of five states. And thank you very much for doing the book.
Thank you, Alka, and thank you for the conversation, and thank you for making the time today. A pleasure as always to see you, and I'm glad we could chat.
Yes, I'm so glad to.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Manjari. Thank you, the Pune PILF, for this wonderful session. And there we are.
Thanks. All right.
This conversation was a thrilling start to the festival. I thank the guests on our behalf. It was truly an amazing session. I am sure our listeners thoroughly enjoyed it and their interest in history has also piqued a little more. We thank Dr. Alka Pande and Manu Pillai for being our guests here at Pune International Literary Festival 2021. Please do join us for our next discussion, The Fine Line Between Fantasy and Horror, at 2 p.m. We thank our title partner Vishwakarma Publications and our bookstore partner Crossword. Thank you.